Before beginning the story, I'd like to say a big thank you for visiting my new channel. I'm going to be uploading alternate history-related stories every single day. If that sounds good, be sure to leave a like and don't forget to subscribe. It means a whole lot when just getting started. I hope you enjoy the story. My father was not a sentimental man in any way that showed on the outside. He didn't hug easily or say things directly that could be said indirectly, and his house reflected this, spare and functional, a place built around usefulness rather than comfort. So when I started clearing it out after he died, I expected to find tools and hardware and the practical infrastructure of a man who fixed things rather than felt them. I found those things. I also found the box. My name is Garrett. I drill wells for a living, residential and agricultural, working a region that covers about 4 counties of mixed terrain. I drive a rig truck and I work alone, and I've been doing it since I was 22. Which is the age my father decided I was ready and handed me the contacts and the equipment and walked away from the business in the particular way he handed things off, completely and without ceremony. I'm 40 now. He died in February after a heart situation that moved faster than anyone had anticipated, and I've spent the 3 months since then driving out to his place on weekends and sorting through the accumulated evidence of his 71 years. It's slow work. Not because there's so much of it, but because clearing a dead person's house requires a kind of decision-making that uses a different part of your brain than regular decisions. Every object is a question. Every question has weight. The fireproof box was in the closet of his bedroom, on the high shelf behind a row of folded flannels, which was exactly where my father would put something he wanted to keep private without being obvious about it. It was the size of a shoebox, grey steel with a combination lock that took me 2 afternoons to open because my father used the same rotation of 4 numbers for everything, and I had to work through them systematically. Inside were 2 manila envelopes, each sealed with a metal clasp, each labeled in his handwriting. The first one said Garrett in plain letters. The second one said Garrett with a small mark beside it that I initially read as a smudge, and then realized was a deliberate symbol, a small parallel line drawn carefully next to the name. I opened the first envelope. My childhood, as I knew it. The house on Della Road where I grew up. My father younger, my mother before she left. The dog we had for most of my elementary years. My face at various ages, 5 through maybe 16. The standard photographic record of a person being raised somewhere. I recognized every image. I recognized the rooms, the yard, the light. I opened the second envelope. The same face, my face, aging across the same span of years in the same increments. But none of the rest of it was mine. The house in these photos was adobe, low and sprawling, with a covered porch running the length of the front and the particular flat dry light of the southwest falling across it. The yard was desert scrub and red dirt. The rooms visible in interior shots had tile floors and a different furniture entirely. There was a dog in some of these too. Different dog. A lean, pale-colored animal I'd never seen. I went through every photo twice. My face in both sets was identical in all the ways faces are identical across time. The same ears, the same specific way my eyes sit, the same birthmark on my collarbone visible in a summer shot from both envelopes. Same collarbone, same mark. 2 different yards. I put both envelopes on my father's kitchen table and sat there until the light changed. My father had photographed 2 childhoods, 2 versions of me growing up in 2 different places, and he had kept both sets in a locked box in his bedroom closet for what looked like 40 years. I drove home and didn't sleep well, and came back the next weekend with that specific focus you develop when you know there's more to find and you're going to find it. I went through his things differently after that. Not sorting, searching. His main journal I already knew about. He'd kept one since before I was born, a simple log of days, nothing elaborate. The kind of journal a practical man keeps because he finds it useful rather than because he's processing anything. I'd read through parts of it in the first weeks after he died. Standard entries, weather, work, occasional notes about my visits. The second journal was in the drawer of his nightstand, underneath a layer of those things that collect in nightstand drawers, receipts and chapstick, and a watch with a dead battery. This one was newer, a different notebook, and it started 3 years ago. I sat on the edge of my father's bed and read it in one sitting. He'd known about the other Garrett for a long time, longer than I would have thought possible from the outside. He wrote about it the way he wrote about everything, plainly and without much editorializing, as if recording facts he'd accepted and moved past. He described discovering the photographs by accident, a process I didn't fully understand from his description, but that seemed to involve a specific quality of light through a particular window in the old house on Della Road at a specific time of day. A window he'd noticed did something unusual and had eventually learned to use deliberately. He wrote about guilt, not performatively, just as a fact he carried. He had a son growing up in a different place through no choice of either of them, and he had known about it, and he hadn't been able to do anything except document it and carry the knowing. Then 3 years ago, the other Garrett had found him. My father wrote about the first visit with the same flat affect he used for everything. But underneath the flat affect, I could read what I'd learned to read in him over 40 years, which was the specific texture of something that had mattered to him deeply. He wrote about a man who looked like me and knew things about our father that I knew, and some things I didn't. Things specific to whatever version of a father he'd had in that adobe house in the Southwest. He wrote about sitting at the same kitchen table where I was now reading this journal and talking across it with a version of his son that had grown up with desert light instead of the grey lake country light I'd grown up under. He wrote in one of the journals a few moments of open feeling. I couldn't send him away. He is as real as Garrett is. Both of them are real. I don't know how to make sense of a world where that's true, but it appears to be true, and I'm too old to pretend otherwise. He'd let the other Garrett visit. Over 3 years, they'd developed something my father called simply a relationship, which was the most he'd ever call anything. The other Garrett came every few months, sometimes stayed a night or 2 in the spare room. My father had cooked for him. They'd worked on the truck together. The entries describing these visits were the warmest writing I'd ever seen from my father, and I had to put the journal down twice while reading them because the warmth was for someone with my face, and that was a difficult thing to sit with. The last entry was 4 days before my father died. It said he was worried about what would happen to the other Garrett when he was gone. He wrote that he understood he'd been functioning as an anchor point for the crossing, that his awareness of both versions and his willingness to hold that awareness had been what allowed the other Garrett to move between threads with any stability. He wrote that he didn't know what would happen to that stability without him to anchor it, and that he was sorry he hadn't figured out a solution before running out of time. He wrote, "I hope they're decent to each other." I set the journal down and sat in the spare room for a while. The spare room where my father had housed another version of me every few months for 3 years. It looked like the spare room I'd always known. Plain, functional. A dresser, a bed, a window facing the backyard. But there was a jacket on the hook behind the door that wasn't my father's. It was a work jacket, canvas, the kind I own about 3 of myself. It wasn't mine. I checked the size. Same size as mine. I checked the wear pattern. Whoever owned it worked with their hands in the same general way I worked with mine. I hung it back on the hook and went to check the rest of the house more carefully. Food in the refrigerator that wasn't there when I had visited 2 weeks ago. Not a lot. The kind of careful, minimal stocking of someone who wasn't sure how long they'd be staying and didn't want to be presumptuous about it. My father's old truck in the driveway with the odometer sitting higher than I'd left it. Someone was staying in my father's house. I went back to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at the table and waited. Not in a tense way, just in the way you wait when you've worked something out and you're ready for the next part. He came in around 4 in the afternoon through the back door, which he unlocked with a key, which meant my father had given him one. He stopped when he saw me. I've tried to think about how to describe this part. The closest I can get is that it was like looking at a photograph of yourself that you don't remember taking. The face was right. The proportions were right. The way he stood was right in all of the general ways, and different in the small specific ways that come from a lifetime of different environments. He was a little more weathered than me, in the particular way of someone who'd spent decades in dry, high-altitude sun. His hands were the same shape as mine, but the wear on them came from different work, or the same work in different soil. He looked at me with an expression I recognized because I'd been wearing a version of it for 3 months. Grief. The specific and ongoing variety. I said, "You have a key." He said my father had insisted he take one. He said he was sorry for being here without letting me know. He said he'd seen my truck and almost turned around, and then decided that turning around wasn't fair to either of us. I told him to sit down. He sat across the table from me, and we looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of 2 people who are trying to establish terms. I told him I'd read the journal. He said he'd figured I would. He said he'd hoped I'd find it before we ran into each other, so the conversation could start somewhere past the beginning. I asked him what the crossing had been like without my father anchoring it. He said it had gotten unstable. He said he could feel the thread fraying the way you feel a floorboard going soft before it fails, not a sudden thing, a gradual worsening. He said the house had been the most stable point left, and that he'd been staying here trying to hold on to it while he figured out what to do. I asked him what he wanted to do. He said what he wanted and what was possible might not be the same thing, and he was trying to make peace with that. I asked him about growing up in the Southwest, not strategically, just because I wanted to know. He talked about it the way I'd talk about Della Road, specifically and without much sentiment. The practical texture of a childhood remembered by a person who works with their hands. The quality of that flat, dry light. The particular cold of desert nights. A father who had the same plainness mine did, but expressed it differently, with more space between words, more time outdoors, the same inability to say directly what could be said indirectly. The same father, the same man, differently placed, bringing up a different version of his son in a different landscape and being recognizably himself in both. I told him about the photographs, both sets. He said he knew about them. He said our father had shown him his set years ago, the same way he'd clearly meant for me to find mine. I asked him if he'd understood what the photographs were. He said he'd come to understand that they were the physical record of his existence in this thread. That our father's act of documenting him across both childhoods had been the original anchor, the first point of connection, and that the photographs were what the thread had rooted itself around. I thought about that for a while. I want to tell you, the conversation stayed easy. It didn't. There was a stretch in the middle of it where he argued, not angrily, just with the focused precision of someone who knows his counter-arguments as well as you do, because of course he did. He knew every way I'd push back because he'd have pushed back the same ways. He knew what I'd say about the house and about the practicalities and about what happens when two people are trying to occupy the same space that only has room for one of them. He knew all of it, and he made his case with it, and his case was not without merit. He said he wasn't asking me to give anything up. He said he just needed stable ground. He said our father had managed to hold space for both of them, and he didn't think that was impossible. He just needed time to find a way to make it work. I said I understood what he was asking. I said I also understood that our father had been a specific and unusual person who had managed something that I wasn't sure I could manage, which was holding two versions of his son in his awareness simultaneously without it pulling him apart. I said I wasn't built the same way. I said that wasn't a criticism of either of us. It was just a fact about the limits of what I could be an anchor for. He looked at me across my father's kitchen table. I said I was sorry. He said he knew. I got the two envelopes from the table where I'd left them. I put them on the counter, and I went to my father's kitchen drawer where he kept the utility lighter he used for the camp stove burner, and I used it. Not in anger, in the specific stillness of someone doing a hard thing cleanly, because it's the only clean way to do it. Both sets. I watched my own childhood go, and his too, all those parallel years of the same face in different light, and I felt something I don't have a name for that sat somewhere between grief and relief, and the particular exhaustion of a decision that was necessary and therefore made. He faded before it was finished. Not dramatically. The same gradual way my father's journal had described. The same softening of presence, like a signal losing its source. By the time the last photograph was gone, he wasn't at the table anymore, and the kitchen was quiet. In the way a kitchen is quiet when only one person is in it. I cleaned up and finished what I'd come to do that day and drove home in the early dark. I kept one photograph. I made that decision before I lit the lighter, and I set it aside, and I kept it. A single image, myself At about 7 years old, standing on the covered porch of an adobe house in that flat southwestern light, with my squinting expression and the dog I'd never owned sitting at my feet. I keep it in my glove box. I don't look at it often. I know it's there. I finished clearing my father's house over the following 2 weekends. I sold it to a young couple from the next county who wanted the land more than the structure, which my father would have considered a sensible transaction. I drove away from it for the last time on a Sunday afternoon, and I didn't look in the rearview mirror because there was nothing there to see anymore, and because some decisions deserve to stay decided. I've been back to my regular work since then, drilling wells across 4 counties, driving the rig, working alone, which suits me the same way it always has, my father's territory, in every practical sense. I know these roads the way he knew them, and I know them the way he meant for me to know them, completely, and without needing them to be anything else. Last week, I drove through the main street of Aldenmere on the way back from a job, and I passed a travel agency, the old-fashioned kind that still has posters in the window, and one of the posters was a southwestern landscape, red rock formations, dry flat light, the kind of sky that goes on longer than a Midwest sky has any business going on. I pulled over. I sat in my truck and looked at that poster for about 5 minutes. I felt something for that landscape that didn't belong to me in any way I could account for. Not longing exactly, more like the feeling of a word on the tip of your tongue that you can't quite reach. Recognition without memory. Familiarity without origin. I pulled back into traffic and drove to my next job. But I booked a trip to New Mexico last week through a website. On my phone. 3 nights in a small place outside of Santa Fe, leaving in 6 weeks. Solo trip, no agenda, just the driving and the landscape, and the particular open quality of time that you only get when there's nothing you have to be doing. I've been telling myself it was just time for a vacation, that I've been working hard, and my father would have said something ungenerous about people who don't take time off, and he'd have been right. That's probably all it is. But I keep thinking about that dog, the lean, pale-colored animal sitting at the feet of a 7-year-old with my face on a porch I've never stood on. I keep thinking about what it would have been like to grow up under that kind of light. Not better or worse, just different. The same person grown in different soil, seeing what different soil produces. My father documented both. He thought we were both worth the trouble. I'm trying to think of it that way. I'm trying to let that be enough.